Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1274. Top of page 1274. Okay, so what we've been discussing, just 1 second. What we've been discussing is in the context of answering the question about reward in this world. Why does the Chazal say, why do the sages say that there's no reward in this world when there is reward, and only in Olam Haba in the future, when there is reward created through our work in this world? So he hasn't answered this question yet, but began talking about how mitzvahs access Pnimius Ha'or. That without mitzvahs, the structure of existence, like I described it as the art, is created by the artist, which is God, but it's the external expression, so to speak, of the divine. Mitzvahs connect to the internal workings and the internal thought and will of the divine, of God, in the purpose of existence. So mitzvahs, in that sense, transcend the regular hierarchy and structure of existence, and are able to draw down the etzem into this world. Now with kavana and with simcha shel mitzvah, joy, it also comes into a revealed way, and we also transcend the hierarchy through joy. But the real power is the mitzvahs that reach all the way that inner dimension. So what we've been learning is, to explain that, the Rebbe Rashab went into the Kuntus Achron that explains the Priyetz Chaim, l'havaninya mashakazu Priyetz Chaim, in what is the strength of mitzvahs, or the way he puts it is Torah and mitzvahs and Halochos over Ava v'Yira. So that's been discussed. We began this topic on the paragraph on page 1272. Through 1273, discussed there were access muhus chochma ilah, not just the chochma, the wisdom of God as it gets concealed in creation, and the angels only experience the cognitive emotions that are expression of the mind, but you actually have a revelation of Chochma Ilah in the Halochos, and as he explains in the mitzvahs, that when you do a mitzvah, you're actually manifesting a divine experience, not just the divine as it's concealed in creation, like he gave the example of the Esrog. But in Halacha, it's even more so, because the Halachos reflect God's wisdom. Who wrote these Halachos? Who decided what is right, what is wrong? What is the din in a particular situation where, let's say, Reuven and Shimon disagree, or other issues that halacha addresses, whatever it may be, shiurim, measurements, laws of litigation, laws of damages, etc., etc. So that is a manifestation of God's Chochma Ilah, actual Chochma Ilah. But as we learned in the last paragraph, in the bottom of page 1273, since halachas deal with dvarim gashmim, physical things, it needs a lavush. It needs a garment of Briyah and Yetzirah. So on one hand, it's reflecting a lakus because it's divine wisdom, but it's not a lakus without the garment. In Atzilus, things are all discussed purely on divine levels. Spheres, Chochma, Bina, everything would be thus discussed on purely spiritual levels. Since we want these halachas to relate to the world as we know it, because they're halachas that deal with physical matters, with physical discussion, with people's exchanges, with interactions, relationships, and whatever, even Hilchos Esrog, the laws of an Esrog. An Esrog is a physical object. It's a physical fruit. What makes an Esrog kosher? What is not kosher? And same thing with all other things that halacha addresses. So he says, that's why it's a slapshus be'ed HaNeshomo of Briyah Yetzirah, that, because you can't have Chochma Ilah bli slapshus, mepnei shalocha shelifnei medabrim bedvarim gashmim. And Chochma Ilah of Atzilus, efshe shetidaber binyanim agashmim ki'im binyani alakus levad. So you need to have some garment that takes the Chochma Ilah, God's wisdom, and turns it into a language and a relationship with things that we can relate to, like an interface. It's exactly that. It's an interface. Okay. Rak bechinas HaNeshomo the Briyah Yetzirah shezeh bechinas chitzenius hakelim the Atzilus shekamei shabo b'Briyah she'einu kamei she'en b'Atzilus. That's what happens. And Ima Yesem, I'm reading on top of page 1274 just to go over what we learned. Ima Yesem alakus mamish. On one hand, we said they're alakus mamish. What does that mean? Not a lakus without a garment. A lakus mamish is that they're not an alien entity. They're not a foreign entity. They're divine. But it's a lakus as it's commensurate to Briyah and Yetzirah. L'daber b'inyonei hanevroim. To speak, it's a lakus as it's speaking about inyonei hanevroim. Basically, you would say Atzilus would be godliness, but it's not speaking in matters that relate to this existence. It is godly words, and it's God's message and God's wisdom. But when you want, how does God speak about inyonei hanevroim? That is Halochos. Now, a step lower than that is the nefesh and ruach of Briyah Yetzirah. There would be God speaking about creation itself, not God's will in creation. So, in other words, let's say the creation of Yehi Rakia, the Asar Mamoris, we call Mila de Hedyeta. These are like more the mundane language of the king, of God creating the world. There, the divine energy is concealed, and the main focus is the actual creation. Light, Rakia, the heavens, earth, vegetation, the animals, the celestial bodies, the animals, the fish. So there's also divine energy there. But like we learned earlier, that's a nivra. There you don't see the Chochma law. What does God want of this creation? Halacha tells you what God wants, how to use this creation. Once you see this creation, this art, what are you going to use it for? That's halacha. But on the other hand, halacha has to speak about matters of this world. On the other hand, halacha is speaking God's will. So that's the perfect interface. Atzilus is only God's will and wisdom. The creation itself, nefesh ruach of Briyah Yetzirah and Asiyah, I should also say, or let's say Briyah Yetzirah, is the actual art, the world itself. And halacha is the neshama of Briyah Yetzirah that manifests the kelim of Atzilus, like I explained in the previous class, that the kelim are an extension of, and they're an expression of the oir of Atzilus, but they're now coming Briyah Yetzirah, so they are a lakus, as it's discussing matters of Nevroim. That's what halacha is. Okay. And that's why through the hislapshus, the enclothing, not Maaver, not passing through, of the muhus, of the personality of the supernal wisdom of Atzilus, the b'chinas HaNeshomo, in the level of HaNeshomo of Briyah Yetzirah, the liyah shezel lakus mamish, hakam shezel b'chinas chitzenius hakelim be'etzem. Even though it's chitzenius hakelim, but it's still a lakus. Even chitzenius hakelim is godliness, as we discussed. Yechela lekabel b'chinas chochma law, so it's able to receive the chochma law of Atzilus, sheba be'er HaNeshomo, the b'chinas hasagas hamahus kanal, which now manifests in the HaNeshomo and hasagas hamahus, that we actually understand the personality of what God wants and God's wisdom in existence. Not just the wisdom of creating existence, the wisdom of how to use existence toward the purpose of creation. And that's where we stopped. So I'm going to continue from line 4 on page 1274. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So let's continue on. V'yadua, and I'll stop for questions. You know what? I'll stop right now. Does anybody want any clarity on what we said, what I've said right now? Because the subject is not finished. There's going to be more clarity as we learn, but just in case anybody wants me to focus on anything. So he continues, V'yadua, and it's known, shebi islapshus zeis, in this islapshus, remember, islapshus is what? Is one thing dresses in another. Let me just elaborate a bit about that. Let's take a physical example. When you get dressed, you put on garments, a shirt, pants, whatever garments you put on, jacket, suit. The garments are not part of who you are. You can easily remove them. You can easily dress. You can change anytime. What is part of who you are? So you have a soul and you have a body. But a body, even though sometimes it's called a garment, but it's not a garment that you can easily replace. That garment will be with you your entire life. It's so-called a garment that is united with the soul to become one. And we learned about this in volume 1 at length. The difference between garments like clothing, like your jacket, versus, let's say, your very skeleton and limbs and organs. So though the limbs and organs are kalim to the oyr of your neshama, but they are bound together. A garment is an outside entity, but a garment does affect who you are, because how you project to others, even though the garment does not change you, but how you project to others. You put on a certain garment on Shabbos, it's a more dignified garment. You put on a garment when you go to work, or you go out to, or you go into the field, or you're doing some menial labor. It's a different type of garment. So to say that a garment doesn't have any connection, you can't. It's a form of expression. Maaver, as we learned, is passing through. Maaver is like a funnel. The garment doesn't have any, it's not like one thing manifesting within another. Hislapshus is vital in Ishtalshalus, like we learned at the bottom of page 1272. We spoke about the Hislapshus Patsufim Zebezeh. When these configurations or structures or visages, another name for passer is a visage, but I like to use the word structure, as they manifest. Moichin manifests in midis, it's not Maaver. Your mind is contemplating on something, it appreciates it, and then it communicates and dresses up into the emotions, that the emotions now should be drawn, attracted to it. So that's called Islapshus. Maaver, as I discussed in earlier classes, is passing through. It's like a neshama of Moshe Rabbeinu, for example, is a neshama of Atzilus. But all neshamas come through Atzilus. The difference is Moshe's neshama travels like an express train from Atzilus into Asiyah. And it's only derech Maaver, it only passes through Briyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. So the Alter Rebbe does say, in this, we're going to soon mention it, that Maaver also has some impact. It's not completely neutral, but it's still passing through. So therefore, like it says in L'Kutei Torah, the Rebbe cites it often, that when Moshe stood and spoke to Parei, it was a neshama of Atzilus speaking to the lowest of Erves Haaretz of Parei. Our neshamas go through Briyah, Yetzirah, Asiyah, like we say every day, every morning in davening, Ata Barasa, neshama shenesati b'taherihi. That's Atzilus. But then Ata Barasa, and Ata Yetzarta, Ata Nefachta bi, Ata Meshamer b'kib. It goes through Briyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah through Islapshus. That's why we don't call most people a neshama of Atzilus, even though it's rooted there. But Atzilus manifested in Islapshus and Briyah in Yetzirah, and Yetzirah and Asiyah. It's the difference, for example, when a teacher teaches a very abstract, pure idea, but then for certain students, he needs to give an example. That's Islapshus, because the student is receiving the idea through the example. Now, the mashal itself is not necessary for the idea. One day, the student may be able to shed the example and just understand the moral of the message without the example. But practically speaking, right now, the student couldn't understand it without the example. So the mashal becomes a lavush. What happens if he has to dress it up in a second mashal, a mashal for a mashal? So that's a lavush within a lavush, and so on. And it says, Shlomo HaMelech explained something by Yimshal. He gave example, 3,000 levels of examples, not just 3,000 different examples, an example of an example of an example, just to show you how you can take an idea and go all the way downward, all the way even to a little child, and explain it on the child's terms. That's Islapshus. Maaver means that it's passing through and has a little impact, but it still retains its original identity. It's not the Islapshus within a mashal. So when we say that Chochma law of Atzilus is Islapshus in HaNeshomo of Briyah Yetzirah, we're saying that it is dressed in a garment. That garment allows it to talk about Dvarim Gashmim. Take away that garment, Atzilus, Chochma law Atzilus would not talk about things that relate to this physical world. It would be pure God's wisdom within every halacha, without it speaking in the language that we need in order to establish the halacha, or able to analyze it, or even debate the issue. When a Rav looks into what is the halacha of something, he needs to have something to hold on to. So that's what he says here. So he says, now Yudua, shebislapshus zois. This now is, I'll read inside. This is slapshus of Chochma law, mahus Chochma law, into the neshama of Briyah Yetzirah, through the kelim chetzenius kelim of Atzilus, which is rooted in the outer kelim of Atzilus. Shamadrega al yena museges ba madrega tachtena. that a higher level is now comprehended and understood by Madrega in a lower level. In this situation, the higher level becomes like the personality of the lower level. Like, let's go back to the example. If I give an example for an idea, even though the idea is the main message, but now the idea has taken on the personality of my mashal, or else the mashal wouldn't work. The mashal has to be one that is now has changed the personality of the idea, not changed its message, not changed its content. It's God's wisdom, but it's changed its presentation. In other words, in the Shama Briyah is talking now the language of halacha, the language that if Reuven and Shimon have an argument, here's what you do. That language is the mechus of the Madrega Tachtena. The Chochma law is now manifesting in there. And it assumes ki mechus Madrega Tachtena. And also the other way around, like we learned at the bottom of page 1272, Madrega Tachtena, mis'ala al yedeze, b'maylosa u'madregosa. Remember, on the other hand, it's also true. The mashal, had it not been an example for this idea, it would just be an example. It wouldn't have the same value. But when you use the example to explain something higher, that mashal, that levush, that madrega tachtena, I should say, gets elevated also from its maila madrega, from the way it would have been without being that garment or that manifestation. So it goes both ways. The higher level, it comes down and its personality is now defined. When I say personality, again, it's the paradigm or what did I say before? The way it's the presentation of it is commensurate and according to the lower level, but the lower level has also been elevated higher than it would have been on its own because it's serving as a manifestation, as a garment for the higher level. Valkain, and therefore, and therefore, through the enclothing and the manifesting of the supernal wisdom of Atzilus into the energy of neshama of Briyah Yetzirah, which is what we're talking about, where Halochos are, is capable of now speaking about physical matters, by Halochos haruchos lefneinu, in the halachas that are presented to us, the halachas as they are manifest in our reality, the halachas of Torah, all the laws of Torah, the Mishnah of Talmud, both in the Mishnah and the Talmud. Mishnah, of course, is the Tanoim, the Talmud is the Amoraim, the two parts. Mishnah is the first generation where the halachas are more brief, and then the Talmud develops them further. And here he indeed says, the question was asked in the last class, is there a difference between Briyah and Yetzirah? So I'm assuming when Yecheskel asked the question, he saw what it says here. So now he does say in the parentheses, Shehem Briyah v'Yetzirah kaneda. So here briefly in the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab is answering the question. He's saying, yes, neshama of Briyah is the halachas as they are Mishnah, and halachas as they are in Talmud, which explains the Mishnah, is Yetzirah. So Mishnah would be the first place where halacha begins to manifest, and Talmud, as it develops it further, is Yetzirah. So there you have it. So the Eira Neshama Briyah Yetzirah of halachas is the distinction Briyah Yetzirah in Mishnah and Talmud, but being that it's not really the key point he wants to make here, he's not going here to explain the difference between Mishnah and Talmud and Briyah Yetzirah. He wants to just explain that halacha is manifesting Chochma law. So it's in general the whole Talmud, Mishnah and Talmud. Specifically, it's Briyah Yetzirah. Okay. And now he's going to give an example actually of halacha. U'kamoy derech mosel. Like for example, b'nikivas haveshet. If there's a pierce, the veshet is the, what is the veshet? How do you translate veshet? When you're talking about an animal, you want to know if it's kosher or not. So veshet is one of the, when you shecht an animal, you shecht the veshet. What's the translation of veshet? Maybe someone can look it up. I think it's the, what's veshet in translation? Do you guys know? I'll look
The
it up.
esophagus.
I think so. That what it says? Did you look up a translation?
Yeah.
I think it's the esophagus. Yeah. Yeah. The esophagus. So when you talk about the laws of kashrus, if there's a nekev is a hole, if there's some puncture or some wound in certain parts of the animal, it renders the animal not kosher. So he says like this: if the vesher has a puncture, a hole, or a wound, it's considered treif. That's halacha. The halacha manifests God's wisdom. God wants that to be the way. Now, why is that the way? There's explanations, because a wound in the esophagus of this nature basically is terminal. If it's not terminal, it's not considered necessary treif, because ultimately will cause the animal to die. So even though the animal's not dead yet, because it's on its way, it's like just like you can't eat a dead animal, you can't eat an animal that's about to die. So a terminal illness with that. So that's the wisdom. Now, why God doesn't want kosher, why God considers that rendered not kosher? That's a discussion we're not going into now. But it's definitely Chochma law, because God determined that. That's what he said. That's halacha. But the halacha is not speaking in spiritual terms in Atzilus. It's talking about an actual esophagus and a nekev and a hole in it and a wound or a puncture. So how is that possible? That's because the Madrega Al-Yena, in this case, Chochma law, manifested like a lavush in the language and in the paradigm of physical things. In this case, the veshet and the nekivus veshet. And that's why it can speak in this language. So even though it's not yet Asiyah, the lowest of the worlds, but also Briyah Yetzirah is already a step away from Atzilus. Atzilus, this conversation about nekivus veshet would be, you know what? I'll give you an example. It would be if Chochma and Bina are not properly transmitting to Zah, to Midas, because there's some type of puncture or some type of severing in the flow, so that would be considered something inappropriate. But that's a language that's not Halochos Aruchos Lefenenu. That's a spiritual concept. That would be the root, the spiritual concept of why, or what the idea of nekivus veshet would be in spiritual world, in Atzilus. But we need halacha because we live in this world. We need to know how it manifests in a real way in the laws of halacha, kashrus, and treifus. So that's why the levush of HaNeshomo, Briyah Yetzirah, adds that dimension that takes the Chochma law and puts it into a language that relates to us in an actual halacha, in this case of nekivus veshet, of the puncture or the hole within the esophagus. Okay. Only thing is, hu benivroim ruchnim. In Briyah Yetzirah, it's still nivroim ruchnim, but it's nivroim. It's not pure alakus as in a divine dimension. It's alakus, but it's alakus as it manifests in the nivroim. Ruchnim u'kamoy b'pnei shoyer ma'asmoil. Okay, so let me now, I have to elaborate because the Rebbe Rashab is being very, very brief. But let me read one more line and then I'll explain the whole thing. Mashenkim ba'atzilus hu b'chinas alakus ba'eres alyenim. In Atzilus, the conversation is all about divine alakus, godliness, about the eres alyenim, about the higher energies. V'hein b'chinas shemes v'tzirufim. There, it's all in the language of God's names and permutations and different combinations of God's names. It's all, basically, it's like the inner wiring. Think of it like the difference between a computer language, the zeros and ones. We can't relate to zeros and ones. We need the garment of that is called the interface, that whether it's whatever computer language that create, and then we need to have the interface that makes it user-friendly. You know, what Microsoft, for example, really ultimately, why it became such a powerhouse is because they created the proper outer interface, what we call Windows, that you can see a screen and your home screen gives you different icons, you click on it, and automatically the computer programming is happening behind the scenes. So you could say Atzilus is like on the divine programming of something. It's like the spiritual DNA but for it to be functional on our level, it has to manifest in Briyah Yetzirah. But Briyah Yetzirah is already the level of Nivraim, but Nivraim Ruchnim. So let's explain it in this context. I mentioned the Nekivas Aveshet in Atzilus would be how the Eiris are working with each other or they're not working. So in other words, something kosher would mean that the Eiris are flowing properly into the Kelim. Nekivas Veshet would mean that on a certain spiritual level of the spiritual esophagus, if you wish, but it's not a physical one anyway, it's not even a spiritual one. It's really completely on a divine level, that there's somewhere a puncture that the Eir and the Keli cannot communicate completely. They're not connecting. In the world of Briyah Yetzirah, now it takes on something that is a nivra. What's a nivra? We're talking about an animal, but it's still a spiritual animal. It's the Pnei Sheir Shebe Merkava. So we know that the animals below in this earth evolved from the animals in the spiritual realm. Just like there's an ox or a behemoth, an animal on earth, there's in the Merkava, in Briyah and Yetzirah, there's a thing called Pnei Sheir Shebe Merkava. It's not a physical sheir, but it has components that a sheir below can relate to. In Atzilus, you wouldn't even call it sheir. In Atzilus, you would call it Eiris, Shemus, Serufim. You wouldn't even call it a sheir. It would be like the difference between physical water, that's in this world, Asiyah. Spiritual water would be in Chesed, would be like the different, like Malach Michal and Malach Gavriel in the worlds of Briyah Yetzirah. They're entities, but they're spiritual entities. Michal is a manifestation of Chesed, but he's an entity. And Atzilus, you wouldn't even have those names. It would only be purely Chesed and Gvura. God's divine energy to give and God's divine energy to withhold or to discipline or to restrain. Chesed and Gvura. In Briyah Yetzirah, it would take on some shape and form, spiritual shape and form. And in Asiyah, it would take on physical shape and form. So what the Halochos are, he's saying, is Briyah Yetzirah of Neshama, which is manifesting into, starting to talk the language of something that we can relate to, even though it's still Ruchni. So how does it ultimately become Gashmi? He's going to say that. So let me continue reading and we'll see in a minute. So anyway, there everything is in divine language and the inner divine wiring of something. That is what Chochma law and Atzilus itself talks about before it comes into HaNeshomo of Briyah Yetzirah. There it's going to talk about things in Eiris Alyenim, in Shemus, Serufim, everything on a divine, all divine language. In order for that Chochma law to be able to speak the language, in the matters of creation, it's specifically through manifesting in the HaNeshomo of Briyah Yetzirah, which gives it, that is beginning to give it the shape and form of a creation. The Shama Daber has been Nivraim Ruchnim. There it begins to speaking about at least Nivraim Ruchnim, but it's Nivraim. It's not just God's names and the Eiris of Atzilus. Vayidei Maaver Levush Asiyah. And now he goes back, and through passing through the Levush of Asiyah, and I'll explain in a moment why does it pass through, why is it not Slapshus? I mentioned already yesterday, but let's just say through passing through the garment of Asiyah, now it gets another garment. And it's now presented in halachas that are presented to us in matters that are physical, not just Nivroim Ruchnim, but Nivroim Gashmi, Minyanim HaGashmi. Now, why is it Maaver? So I pointed out yesterday, the reason it's Maaver because you wanted to maintain that Chochma law level. If it becomes pure Islapshus, then we just said Islapshus means it assumes the identity of the level that it manifests in, that it gets enclosed in. Since Asiyah is a lower level than Briyah Yetzirah, it would become too concealed in this garment. So you say it does go through Asiyah, and it passes through, which has some impact to at least allow it to be related to in a physical way, but it still retains the integrity of the Neshama of Briyah Yetzirah as it's manifesting Chochma law of Atzilus. He doesn't say this explicitly, but that seems to be clearly the case that the Alter Rebbe in Kuntesachen, why he says in Asiyah it's Maaver and it's Islapsus in the Neshama of Briyah Yetzirah. Okay. Whereas the rest of existence, let's just talk about regular things that are not Halochos. There, the Chochma law is mislabish in Briyah Yetzirah and Asiyah, and not just in Asiyah, but also Nefesh Ruach, and there it gets concealed. So if you look at a tree or an apple, so there, before you bring halach into the picture, you only have the creation. It has divine energy, like I said. Lo ya'lechem levad yichya adam. On bread alone, man does not live. Ki al mitzvah pi havai yichya adam. It's on the spark of the divine, of God's speech. That's within the bread that we live up, but there it's concealed. You look at the bread, you don't know what God wants from the bread. You need a Shulchan Aruch for that. There you need halacha. You look at the bread, it's islapshus of Briyah, Yetzirah, and Asiyah. Where halacha, it's islapshus in Briyah Yetzirah, Neshama Briyah Yetzirah, but Maaver through Asiyah. So what the Maaver does is it takes the Nevroim Ruchnim, the Shiur, the animal, the spiritual animal in Briyah and Yetzirah, and gives it now, the halacha can speak about a physical animal and like he said here, the example of the puncture or the hole in the esophagus of that animal. So it's not just a esophagus on a spiritual, it's talking about actual physical thing. So it has something from Asiyah, but it's not to the point that it assumes the personality of Asiyah. It still remains halachos and Chochma law of the Eibishter. So it tells you how to use. The esophagus itself is the slapses of Asiyah. The halacha around the esophagus or the animal is Maaver of Asiyah. So that's what he's saying right here. Okay. V'nimtza. So now he concludes v'nimtza. From this we derive and conclude the halachas haTeira shelifneinu, that the laws of Torah that are before us, in other words, not the halachas in heaven as we learn them today down below. Hein muchus chochma lo Atzilus. Bottom line, they are the personality of the Chochma law of Atzilus. Not just that you know there's wisdom there. You actually know what God wants. So when you learn halacha, you're learning God's wisdom and God's thinking in existence as it relates to existence. However, but that mahus Chochma law is through being enclothed in the garment of the HaNeshomo of Briyah Yetzirah. And like we said before, when the HaNeshomo of Briyah Yetzirah manifests the Chochma law and halacha, it itself becomes far higher level. It gets elevated from where it would have been on its own, because now it's serving as essentially a channel and a manifestation of the Chochma law of Atzilus. And he's now going to go back to, I'm going to stop for questions. Let me finish the paragraph and then I'll stop for clarification. He goes back to the example he gave. If you remember the top of page 1273, he spoke about Seichel and Midas as an example of two partsufim, how the mind dresses into the emotions. So on one hand, it's now not the mind in its pure form, but it's the emotions being driven by the mind. But he said there, the emotions elevate to become like the mind, because the emotions are not just driven by their subjective interests. The mind has influenced them to be attracted to and to love and relate to things that are higher. That's what contemplation does. So he's going to give that an example here. Ukamoyal derech moshel hanal, like the example we spoke about earlier on the top of page 1273, b'midish, about emotions. Sheyesh behem hislapshus hamoichin, that they have within them now, the moichin, the intellect, the cognitive is manifesting in them, and that elevates them. But he's saying here it's, however, even more than that. V'harbi yesim izeh, and in our case, even more than midas and moichin. Harbi yesah, far more than that. Why? Ki hu hislapshus hamohus. Because moichin and midas is not necessarily the mohus of moichin goes into the midas. I think he may have even said that. Yeah, he does say that. Yediyas HaMetzias. And that was on the third line of page 1273. But Chochma Elah, the Mohus, the very personality of God's wisdom, is manifesting in Eir HaNeshama of Briyah Yetzirah. So that's why it's even more. But it's like Moichin and Midas, but much more than that. Harbi Yesim Izeh. Ki hu aslapsos HaMahus Kanal. Ubi Yediyas V'asogas HaTeirah. And now he's adding, and in the knowledge and understanding of Torah, Ein zeh shemasig rab b'chinas Eir HaNeshama de Biyah. Now he says Biyah. Okay. It's not just that you're understanding the energy or the oir, the light and energy of the neshama of Biyah. You're actually grasping Chochma Elah of Atzilus. So though it's coming in the language like a moshel, it's coming in the language and in the paradigm that we can relate to, that will ultimately allow us to relate to in a physical manner. It's an Evroim, but we're grasping not Briyah Yetzirah. The moshel is still a garment to Chochma Elah. That's what we're grasping. And examine or delve into what it said earlier in Maaver Vayidaber as Karbonei Lachmi Hanal. Yeah, this was cited before. That's in volume 1. So there he talks about that when the etzem, an essential entity, when you grab part of it, you grab all of it, Baal Shem Tov says. So that's what he's saying. Because it's Mahus Chochma Elah, it's even though it dresses into the Eir HaNeshama Briyah Yetzirah, you're still grasping the very Chochma Elah. Similar to what the Alter Rebbe says at the end of chapter 4 in Tanya, that even though it's a garment, but you're holding the king. The king is dressed in that garment. Not sure why he doesn't bring this here, but it seems to be very fitting. The Yesh Bezek Tzaz Gili. And it also has some Gili. In other words, what he says in that Maaver there, it's not just Chochma Elah that you have it, but you also have some revelation of the higher supernal wisdom, but as it's manifesting in Briyah Yetzirah. Remember, the Briyah Yetzirah, the Neshama Briyah Yetzirah is not meant to conceal it, so we should understand it. It's meant to create into language that relates to the physical world ultimately. So first the spiritual Nivraim, then the physical Nivraim. But the Chochma Elah is in there. That's the point that he's making here. So when we learn Halacha, we're actually learning the Chochma Elah as it travels through the Eir HaNeshama Briyah Yetzirah. However, so why then do you need Eir HaNeshama Briyah Yetzirah? So he repeats, Rak b'chinas Chochma Elah atzma. However, the reason you need this Eir HaNeshama Briyah Yetzirah because Chochma Elah, the supernal wisdom alone, on its own, it cannot manifest in physical laws. It only can manifest in Atzilus. Its only way of expressing itself is in the language of Atzilus, the Torah of Atzilus. That's called the Torah of Atzilus. That speaks about the Patzufim Al Yenim, the higher structures in the spiritual level, like we said, Oires, Shemes, Sirufim, and so on. However, when you want it to come into physical terms, Ki'im, the only way to do that is rather through its getting enclothed in the Eir HaNeshama of Briyah Yetzirah. That carries and draws, and the personality of Chochma Elah arrives and comes into Biyah, into the worlds of Briyah, Yetzirah, Asiyah, like he explained. Briyah Yetzirah is the Nevraim Ruchnim. It gives it the shape, but it's still on a more spiritual level, but it's already a Nivra, a creation, as opposed to Atzilus, that's pure Halochos, divine. And an Asiyah, ultimately, the Maaver of Asiyah, passing to Asiyah, gives it the Halochos, the Gashmis, the final garment that becomes the Halochos as we know them before us. That's what he says, and that's the conclusion of this paragraph. So I shall stop now to take questions or clarification. And we still have to go back. Obviously, he hasn't finished the whole subject. He's only explained this idea. So we see a little about somewhat how mitzvahs and Torah, even though they reach the highest level, they go through levels. But I don't want to jump the gun. He's going to conclude the topic he began. But right now, he's explained the Kuntus Sachem quite extensively. So any questions or?
I have a question. about 8 lines up from the bottom, where you said, "U'b'chinas or neshama hi gavoha b'yoster al yidei shemitz lavish b'chinas b'chmi il Atzilus." So, which or of the neshama is he talking about there? That is,
Briyah and Yetzirah, both.
Okay, got it. It's elevated because it's enclothing the or neshama of Atzilus. Yes,
Not or neshama, Chochma of Atzilus.
Chochma.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, the or neshama has its own level in Briyah Yetzirah. When it's manifesting Chochma, it becomes it's like an example. An example for an idea. When the example is an example used for a higher idea, the example itself gets elevated.
Got it.
Think of it that way.
Uh-huh.
So both things are happening. Chochma is assuming the personality, so-called the paradigm or the language of the Or Neshama, which gives it the body, so to speak. And on the other hand, that body of Or Neshama, that body, the expression, is elevated to be now expressing Chochma of the higher level. Yeah.
That itself is an interface. A window is an interface between what's outside and inside. It's a very interesting thing. When it's translating machine language into, as you said, user friendly, so that we could relate to it on the human level. So I thought that was a very interesting comparison. What we're talking about here, that the divine language of the Atzilus really doesn't relate to humans at all. It has to go down into Briyah Yetzirah before it takes on human manifestation. Right. About oral synchalic, which is like basic language. What if a person just saw zeros and ones and he wouldn't be able to relate that at all to what his word processor when he writes out, God created the world. You wouldn't notice that. You wouldn't be able to see that relationship at that level. So it has to come down. So I thought that was very important analogy. But my question is, we speak about Moshe Rabbeinu and the Avos as neshamas of Atzilus. But yet, you just said, or we just learned that the term neshamas only really appears in Briyah and Yetzirah. In Atzilus, it's just talking about oral and kalim, shemos, tzurufim, as the Rabbi says here. It's a whole different level. Does that, when we say the neshama of Moshe and the Avos are Atzilus, do they really mean it's a level in Briyah, but it's a level that, like Maaver, as Chochma of Atzilus comes down into Briyah on a Maaver level, it's still in Briyah they have this neshama of Atzilus, or does it really mean that there are neshamas that are somehow pierced through and entered in this world of divinity in Atzilus, which is normally only Orach and Kalim, but their neshama somehow exists in that level?
Look, the fact is, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, they all lived on earth. They were physical human beings. They weren't just spiritual entities. In other words, if we lived then, we would see Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, and so on. So there's no question that they assumed physical garments as they came down. But I gave the example that it's more b'derech Maaver than it is by most human beings. Because even though they did assume physical shape and form, but they retained their Atzilus Dika personality. That they were a Merkava, for example. That when Avram walked this earth, Chesed of Atzilus said to Hashem, what do you need me for? You have Chesed down on earth, walking, a physical walking Chesed. So Avram manifested. So these people, these individuals who were Neshamas of Atzilus on earth, they were Atzilus Dika personalities living in earth. So they had the garments of Briyah Yetzirah see, you have to say there was something there. Maaver would be one way to explain it, maybe a little, or even Islapshus, but a very minimal Islapshus. Because remember, Islapshus itself can be many levels. But when we're talking about a regular human being, even though the neshama is a chelik alakam mal mamish, and it's rooted in very high levels, but it really assumes garments of all the worlds. That's why when the neshama comes down here, you don't see it's shining forth like you would see Moshe Rabbeinu or Avram. There you saw godly people walking this earth, a godly person. Whereas the rest of us are human beings, we have godly neshama, but the neshama has gone through these garments. So it's not changed fundamentally, but from a point of view of expression, it definitely has, it's a physical entity. So it comes down to, like what says in the Alter Rebbe writes about tzaddikim after their passing, that they're more present than in their lifetime. So he explains why. Because a tzaddik's chayim is chayim ruchnim, not chayim psarim. His very life is spiritual life, not physical life, which means ave, yira, and amuna. That's what he says. So since his whole life is really spiritual, the fact that he has flesh and blood is just a keli. It's just an external container, but his whole real life, he lives off ave, yira, and amuna. So even when the body is not there, that continues to live on. By us, our primary life is b'sarim. It's flesh and blood. It's the food we eat. It's the air we breathe. So even though, yes, that there's a spiritual entity and the neshama will live on, but since our very being was more physical than spiritual, so when, God forbid, after 120 years, you don't have that living on because it wasn't the primary person. You could say the legacy lives on, that something lives on in his children, but you cannot say that his primary being, because his primary life was not spiritual. His primary life was physical. That's essentially what Alter Rebbe says. So that would be the contrast of the difference between a truly, the Alter Rebbe would fall asleep on Friday afternoon because in Atzilus, in the higher world, dur mitzvah de zah, it was a time where zah, the midas, went into a type of slumber to prepare for the Shabbos. So Alter Rebbe automatically didn't have to look at the clock. He didn't have to look into a Sefer Kabbalah. He naturally was aligned, so he fell asleep. Rabbi Hillel, it says, would go to sleep and take a nap, sleep. I mean, talking about a nap. Rabbi Hillel would go because he knew what it says. He didn't naturally feel it like we naturally feel hunger or fatigue. But he knew that's the time for it. The rest of us, the rest of us are, maybe we're sleeping for different reasons, or we're eating cholent, or we're doing other things because we're not aligned with those energies. The Alter Rebbe, when he was in prison, he knew the change of the hour, even though he couldn't see day and night, by the tzirufim. The tzirufim of Ayin Beis, tzirufim of Havaya and Adnai, was distinguished between the 24 hours, 12 and 12 hours of day and night. People who are aligned, they sense it. It's like someone who has their hand on the pulse and can sense the zeros and ones, basically. The Alter Rebbe was able to sense the zeros and ones in Atzilus. That's a HaNeshomo of Atzilus on this earth. So that's the difference of how they manifest. So they're all here on the physical earth, but very different type of life experiences.
But the question was, maybe I can explain enough. It seems like neshama, the term neshama, the keli of neshama was actually first created in Briyah. It doesn't exist in it.
No, that's not correct. There's neshama in Atzilus, there's neshama in Ak, there's neshama everywhere. Nefesh, Ruach, neshama, Chai, Yechid exists on all levels. Here, he's talking about nefesh, Ruach, and neshama in Briyah, just to make the contrast between the malachim and their cognitive emotions in Briyah and Yetzirah compared to Halochos and Torah in Briyah Yetzirah, that manifests Chochma law. But the concept of a neshama exists everywhere.
I thought we were learning here that the divine language of Atzilus is oros and kalim, sphira, chesed, gevura, chachma, dina, dat. It's not. It already exists there. I thought we were learning that. That's the. No,
we're learning here the difference between neshama and nefesh and ruach of Briyah Yetzirah. He's not discussing about the level of, you're using the neshama in the wrong way. They're neshamas of Atzilus. There is a concept called the neshama of Atzilus. It's not a contradiction to what he's saying here. He didn't say neshama is exclusively in Briyah. He said in Briyah you have the level of neshama and you have the level of nefesh and ruach. Okay? And
those correspond with Chagas and Mihi, the nefesh ruach.
Generally speaking, neshama is usually Chabad, Moichin. Ruach is Midas Chagas, and nefesh is usually nehi. In general terms, yeah. We learned that earlier too, by the way. If you want to see it, look on page just a second. I think on page 1220. Maybe not. No, later, 1222. 1221, 22, I think he speaks about it. Yeah, but that's generally speaking. Chai Yechida is usually Arich and Atik, Rotzen and Tainug. So basically, it covers Chai is Arich or Rotzen, and Yechida is Atik or Tainug. If you just want the okay.
Locations.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Okay. I mean, I'll begin the next paragraph, but I'll elaborate much more in the next class. He's now going to come back to mitzvahs. You know, we talked about mitzvahs and halochos were somewhat not exactly the same level, because the mitzvah is the actual mitzvah, the halacha is the laws about the mitzvah. So now he's going to come back and say, Kamoy Kain, or Kamoy Kain Yuvan, Be'efanam Shachar Shaidei mitzvahs. Remember, the whole thing began on page 1272. He said that to understand how mitzvahs generate energy in Gan Eden and all the levels, we have to understand. He said, the manner in which or through which mitzvahs draw down this energy. So he said it's from Pnimis Ha'er. So he's now going back to exactly those words. Literally the same words used on beginning in 1272. The manner by which and through which mitzvahs draw down divine energy. So he says, now we're going to understand that based on what we just learned from the Kuntres Achron and the whole explanation of Halochos. Tehinen is barely ill, because now it was explained earlier that mitzvahs and b'chinas kelim. The mitzvahs are kelim. So let me refer you right where that is. That was the whole discussion. On page 1266 at the bottom and 1267, he asked the question, if it's kelim, if the mitzvahs are kelim, so how could they reach all the way to Etzem? And that was the answer. The kelim are rooted higher than the earth, which he concluded on page 1270 and 1271. So he's now referring that. So we explained earlier that mitzvahs are the level of kelim, containers. V'ini yadua, now it's known that mitzvahs teluyim ba'esis havaya. So he's introducing another point now that we have not learned. So let me preface. The mitzvahs are connected to in the letters of Havaya. All the mitzvahs are different expressions of the name Havaya. Shal Shem Zen Nikr mitzvahs Havaya. That's why mitzvahs are called the mitzvahs of Hashem, the mitzvahs of Yud Kei Vav Kei. Oi, sometimes it's called Urches Havaya. The paths, the pathways of Havaya. So you see from this that mitzvahs relate to the name Havaya. So this is a big subject matter, which I'll explain. But let me read inside, then I'll explain. So in Kabbalah, it talks about different mitzvahs. Teluya means literally, sometimes tali can be dependent on, but tali can also mean hanging on. And here teluya means that they are rooted in, they're connected with. So each mitzvah, so to speak, hangs from, or is dependent, or is I don't want to say the word hang because it doesn't make sense, the word hanging, but it's essentially suspended from or connected to letters. So Krishma is connected to the letter Yud. Tefillin is connected to the letter Hey. Every mitzvah has a connection to the letters in different ways. The chen kol mitzvahs. And the same with all the mitzvahs. They're all connected to the letters, which of course explains why it's called kalim, because kalim and letters are interchangeable. So the mitzvahs are connected to the letters. Now he says like this: the chen kol mitzvahs, the shem mitzvah, humam is shem havaya. And the very word mitzvah is actually the same word as havaya. He's going to explain how. In the Hebrew letters, there are different ways that we can create combinations. So mitzvah is mem tzadik vav hey. The vav hey is the last two letters of yud ke vav ke. Mem tzadik replaces the yud hey, in the combination called ad bash. I'll explain it. The Asis yud ke the shem havaya bo b'shem mitzvah b'chiluf ad bash. So chiluf is one of the ways the Hebrew letters are interchanged. So ad bash means the aleph interchanges with the taf. The first interchanges with the last letter. The second interchanges with the next to last letter. The third with the third last letter. It's called at bash. Aleph taf, beis shin. Then would be gimel, resh, dalet kuf. So if you take the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and you place the first one and the last one are interchangeable. The second and the next to last is also, and it goes all the way to the middle letters. So when you do that calculation, so the mem and the tzaddik of mitzvah are exchange the yud and the hey. If you go through it, you'll see how it works. Because tzaddik kuf reish shin taf, tzaddik is the fifth last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Hey is the fifth letter from the front. And the same thing with the mem. The mem is the 11th letter, and the yud going backwards. That is also, the yud and mem are the last two, replace each other. So the yud is the 10th letter from the front, and the mem is the 10th letter from the back. So the word mem sadik in mitzvah, the letters mem sadik replace yud k, and the last letters of mitzvah are exactly vav k. Now we'll explain what's the seichel with this. It's just a play of words? No. So he says like this: remember, tzaddik is vavke, for is vavke loin is chalfu, and the letters vavke, the last letters of mitzvah vavke, do not get replaced. So the Rebbe Rashab is now going to say and ask this question: v'tzarich lahavin mipnei ma esis yudke bo b'mitzvah b'chiluf esis. So why indeed is this the case? If mitzvah connects to havaya, yudke vavke, why the first two letters come in an exchange form? You don't have the actual letters, you have them only in exchange. The yud becomes the mem, and the hey becomes the tzaddik. Why is that the case? So I'm going to stop here because that's the question he's asking. And once he answers this question, we're going to come back and understand something about the mitzvahs as they connect to the highest levels of the divine, but still they come in a slapshus of the chilufim, of the exchange from Yud K to Mem Tzadik. It's going to be similar to the HaNeshomo Briyah Yetzirah, taking Chochma law, but giving it a garment. So the Mem Tzadik of mitzvahs is going to give the garment to the Yud K, but not to the Vav K. And this we'll learn tomorrow, or begin at least learning tomorrow. And that is going to come back to explain the whole idea of mitzvahs and the schar and the reward and the energy it generates, the way it generates energy. So we're going to learn that mitzvahs, even though they touch the etzem, but it's the etzem as it comes into some form of garments that we can relate to, which is very critical to understanding why and when we get reward and how that exactly works. But as I said, let's not jump the gun. It will be all understood. Right now, I'll stop here. So I'm stopping by this question of why Mem Tzadik replaces Yud K in the mitzvah, and it's not just the original letters. So we're at 2/3, or close to the bottom of page 1274. Anybody want to ask anything?
Rabbi Jacobson, isn't it brought down that when a Mashiach comes in Latit Lavo, that we're going to have a new Torah, but it's not, God forbid, the new Torah, but it's actually the atbash of Torah, meaning that that's going to be the revealed, and ultimately that's what will be the new Torah that we're going to be studying. Any comment on that?
I wouldn't make any comment on that because he's not discussing that here. Atbash has many different applications, so I wouldn't address that right now. That's another discussion altogether. When we finish the subject, I can discuss it, but it's not on topic here. That I can tell you right now. Okay?
Thank you.